I stood in my parents' upscale Atlanta kitchen, staring at my 8-year-old daughter's custom Princess Tiana birthday cake shoved head first into the garbage. My sister adjusted her designer engagement ring and smirked, telling me my child wasn't worth wasting fridge space on. I didn't scream. I just picked up my crying daughter and left. The next morning, my mother was sobbing on the phone, begging me to call the venue because my sister's wedding was being canceled. I simply told her I didn't care and hung up. I had no idea that protecting my peace would lead to the ultimate revenge. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The vibrant green and purple fondant was completely smashed against the side of the stainless steel trash bin. Small sugar water lilies, the ones my 8-year-old daughter Chloe had specifically picked out, were scattered among discarded coffee grounds and eggshells. I stood frozen in the center of my parents' sprawling Atlanta kitchen, unable to comprehend what I was looking at. Chloe was clinging to my leg, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs that tore right through my chest. This was supposed to be a joyful Saturday afternoon. I had spent 3 weeks tracking down a specialty baker who could perfectly recreate Princess Tiana for my beautiful brown-skinned girl, ensuring every detail was flawless for her special day. Now that $300 masterpiece was literal garbage. The sharp click of designer heels against the imported tile floor broke through the heavy silence. My younger sister Jasmine walked into the kitchen, casually examining her manicure. She did not gasp or feign an apology when she saw the ruined cake or my devastated child. Instead, she let out an annoyed sigh and adjusted the massive diamond engagement ring on her left hand, making sure the light caught it perfectly. "Connor's parents are flying in from Greenwich tonight," she said, her voice carrying that practiced haughty tone she had adopted ever since she started dating her wealthy white fiancé. "We needed fridge space for the imported caviar. A grocery store sheet cake is fine for a kid whose daddy didn't even stick around." The sheer cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. This was classic Jasmine. She had always been the golden child, the one whose mistakes were smoothed over and whose desires dictated the entire mood of our household. But dragging my innocent daughter into her toxic orbit and weaponizing my status as a single mother was a new low even for her. Connor came from old money, a world of country clubs and trust funds that Jasmine was desperate to assimilate into. She was constantly bending over backward, changing her voice, her style, and her priorities to ensure she fit into his family's rigid elite standards. In her mind, Chloe and I were just embarrassing liabilities who didn't fit the wealthy aesthetic she was trying to project. Before I could even formulate a response to the insult about Chloe's father, my mother, Vivian, rushed into the kitchen. She was wearing a silk blouse and a frantic expression, holding a silver polishing cloth. I expected her to see the cake, to see her granddaughter crying, and immediately reprimand Jasmine. That was the delusion I still carried, hoping that maternal instinct would eventually override her obsession with appearances. Instead, Vivian stopped, looked at the garbage can, and then glared directly at me. "Zora, stop causing a scene," she snapped, completely ignoring the tears streaming down Chloe's cheeks. "Jasmine's wedding is in 3 weeks. Everything is incredibly stressful right now. We cannot have Connor's family thinking we are ghetto over some silly cartoon cake." I stared at the woman who raised me, feeling a cold, hollow space open up in my chest. My mother was actually prioritizing the hypothetical judgment of her future white in-laws over the very real heartbreak of her own black granddaughter. She was calling a beautiful representation of a black princess ghetto just because it took up space that was meant for imported fish eggs. It was a crystal-clear declaration of where Chloe and I ranked in this family hierarchy. We were at the very bottom, beneath the caviar, beneath the wedding aesthetic, and far beneath the approval of Connor's family. For a fraction of a second, the old Zora, the one who spent her entire life trying to prove she belonged in this family, wanted to scream. I wanted to yell about the injustice, to demand an apology, to point out the blatant favoritism that had poisoned my entire childhood. I wanted to remind them that while Jasmine was having her tuition at Spelman paid for by our parents, I was working 2 jobs to put myself through a state school. But looking at Jasmine's smug smirk and my mother's impatient glare, I realized something profound. Arguing with them was exactly what they wanted. It would feed their narrative that I was the difficult, unstable older sister ruining the pristine wedding atmosphere. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I refused to let my daughter see me beg for basic human decency from people who were incapable of providing it. I knelt down smoothly and gathered Chloe into my arms, pressing her tear-stained face against my shoulder. I didn't say a single word. I didn't cry. The silence in the kitchen became heavy, suffocating as I turned my back on my mother and sister. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for the explosion. But I simply grabbed my coat from the hallway chair, walked out the heavy oak front door, and let it close behind me with a quiet, definitive click. The air outside was crisp, pulling me back to reality as I carried Chloe down the manicured driveway. I murmured soft promises into her hair, assuring her that we would get an even better cake, that we would celebrate her birthday exactly the way she deserved. I buckled her into her car seat, making sure she was safe and secure, wiping the remaining tears from her soft cheeks. As I walked around to the driver's side, my phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I assumed it was Vivian calling to complain about my abrupt departure, to scold me for not staying to clean up the mess or apologize to Jasmine. But when I pulled the phone out, the notification on the screen made my blood run instantly cold. It was a high-priority fraud alert from my business banking app. The automated message blared across my screen, requiring immediate verification. Someone had just attempted to authorize a $50,000 wire transfer from my primary corporate account. I stared at the destination listed on the alert. The funds were being routed to the Grand Sterling Estate, which happened to be the most exclusive and expensive wedding venue in the entire city of Atlanta. The exact venue where Jasmine was supposed to be getting married in 21 days. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine still off, listening to my own breathing. They had thrown my child's birthday cake in the trash because we weren't worth the fridge space, but my sister had the absolute audacity to try and drain $50,000 from my business account to fund her luxury wedding. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as a dark, quiet realization settled over me. They thought I was just a struggling single mother playing at a little event planning hustle. They had no idea who I really was, or what I actually owned, and they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. Exactly at 7 in the morning, my phone began vibrating violently against the mahogany nightstand. The harsh buzzing shattered the quiet peace of my bedroom. Beside me, Chloe was still fast asleep, her breathing soft and rhythmic, completely oblivious to the storm brewing outside our walls. I reached for the phone, expecting a client emergency. Instead, the caller ID flashed with my mother's name, Vivian. I let it ring for a few seconds, savoring the silence before swiping to answer. I didn't even get a chance to say hello before her hysterical sobbing blasted through the speaker. Zora. Her voice was shrill, panicked, and breathless. The Grand Sterling just emailed Jasmine. They are canceling the wedding. You have to call them and fix this right now. She didn't ask how Chloe was doing. She didn't apologize for the horrific scene in her kitchen the day before. Her only concern was the preservation of her golden child's perfect day. Do you hear me, Zora? She demanded, her tears instantly morphing into rage when I didn't immediately respond. The email said there was a severe issue with the payment authorization. I know you do your little party planning gigs around town. You must know someone who works in their booking department. Call in a favor. Max out your credit cards if you have to. Connor's parents are arriving for the brunch in a few hours. We cannot lose this venue. If Jasmine loses the Grand Sterling, her life is ruined. Fix your card issue now. I listened to her frantic breathing, taking in the sheer audacity of her demands. She genuinely believed my purpose on this earth was to absorb their abuse and then bankrupt myself to finance their luxury. I looked down at my beautiful sleeping daughter, thinking about the smashed Princess Tiana cake in the garbage. Honestly, I do not care, I said. My voice was perfectly flat, devoid of any warmth or familial obligation. I pulled the phone away from my ear as Vivian inhaled sharply to scream and tapped the red end call button. I then went into my settings and temporarily blocked her number. I needed absolute peace for what I was about to do. I stepped into my walk-in closet and began pulling out my armor. I bypassed the casual clothes and reached for a custom-tailored charcoal suit. As I buttoned the crisp white silk blouse, I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. My family had spent the last decade mocking my career. Whenever they asked what I did, I told them I managed events and hospitality properties. To Vivian and Derek, that translated to a little event planning hustle. They pictured me blowing up balloons, setting up folding chairs, and organizing community center baby showers. They never bothered to ask for the name of my company. They never bothered to look up Apex Pinnacle Holdings. If they had, they would have realized that my little hustle was actually a massive luxury hospitality firm. And if they had paid even a fraction of attention to my life, they would have known the biggest secret of all. 6 months ago, Apex Pinnacle Holdings finalized a highly publicized acquisition. I did not just know someone in the booking department at the Grand Sterling Estate. I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of the entire property. The Grand Sterling was the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. Jasmine had booked my venue using my company's corporate name to impress her wealthy white in-laws while simultaneously calling me ghetto to my face. The irony was so potent, it was almost intoxicating. I kissed Chloe's forehead, leaving her in the care of my trusted live-in nanny, before walking out to my car. I drove straight through the morning Atlanta traffic, bypassing the venue itself and heading directly to my corporate headquarters in Buckhead. The glass doors slid open as I walked into the sleek, minimalist lobby of Apex Pinnacle. The environment was sharp, professional, and ruthlessly efficient, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotional manipulation of my parents' household. I took the private elevator up to the executive suite. Malik, my financial director, was already pacing in front of my office door. Malik was not just my lead financial officer, he was my right-hand man and the operational maitre d' for our highest-tier events. He knew my family dynamic inside and out, and his expression this morning was a mixture of absolute fury and disbelief. "Good morning," Zora Malik said, falling into step beside me as I unlocked my office door. "We have a massive problem, and it is much worse than a declined credit card." I sat behind my desk, tossing my keys onto the polished glass surface. "Show me." Malik dropped a thick, heavy manila folder directly in front of me. "Jasmine did not just try to swipe your personal debit card for a $50,000 deposit," he explained, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "She submitted a fully executed corporate guarantor contract." I opened the folder and stared at the documents inside. My sister had drafted a legally binding financial agreement naming Apex Pinnacle Holdings as the sole financial sponsor for her entire $150,000 wedding weekend. She had listed the holding company as the primary debtor responsible for the venue rental, the imported catering, the top-tier open bar, the floral arrangements, and the luxury bridal suite. But that was not the worst part. I flipped to the final page of the contract, and my blood ran freezing cold. On the bottom line, right above the printed title of Chief Executive Officer, was my signature. It was a near-perfect forgery. Jasmine had practiced the loops and sharp angles of my handwriting until she could replicate it flawlessly. She had submitted this forged document to the venue's accounting department late last night. Her assumption was arrogant and entirely calculated. She knew the venue staff dealt with dozens of corporate sponsors a month. She assumed that because she was my sister, the ground-level employees would see the name Apex Pinnacle, verify the corporate account numbers she had stolen from my mail, and push the approval through without flagging the actual owner. She thought she could have her luxury fairy tale wedding stick my company with a $150,000 bill and walk away untouchable because I would be too afraid of our parents to press criminal charges. She thought she was untouchable. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the black ink of my forged signature. This was not a simple family dispute over a birthday cake anymore. This was felony identity theft. This was corporate fraud. This was a crime carrying serious prison time. As I sat there processing the sheer magnitude of her betrayal, My personal cell phone chimed on the desk. It was a text message from a number I did not have saved in my contacts. But the arrogant, entitled tone gave away the sender immediately. It was Connor. "Zora, stop throwing a tantrum over a piece of cake and call the venue back to pay the invoice," the message read. "My family expects absolute perfection this weekend, and we cannot have this booking fall through. Do not be selfish, pay the balance, and do not embarrass Jasmine." I read the message 3 times, letting the reality of his words sink in. Pay the invoice. Not fix the mistake. Not handle the mix-up. Pay the invoice. He knew about the bill. He knew about the forged corporate contract. Jasmine had not acted alone. She did not have the legal background to draft a corporate guarantor document that looked this authentic. But Connor did. Connor, with his expensive corporate law degree, paid for by his old money family trust, had helped my sister forge my signature to steal from my company. He was entirely complicit in the fraud. He thought he could bully the struggling black single mother into financing his luxury aesthetic. A cold, ruthless calm washed over my entire body. Canceling the wedding and locking them out of the venue was a temporary punishment. It was too easy. It would allow Vivian and Derek to play the victims and paint me as the jealous, bitter older sister who ruined a magical day. No, simply walking away was no longer an option. They had crossed a legal line and they needed to face the devastating absolute ruin of a legal fire. I looked up at Malik, who was watching me closely, waiting for my orders. "Tell the legal team to prepare the liability transfer documents," I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "We are going to accept the signature." I watched Malik's eyes widen in shock, but I held up a hand to stop his protest. "We are going to accept it, but we are going to legally bind the financial liability directly to where Connor feels it most. It is time to introduce his family trust fund to the consequences of his actions." I barely had time to process the sheer audacity of Connor's text message before the security buzzer to my gated townhouse community chimed. The concierge announced that my parents were at the gate demanding entry. I knew exactly why they were here. Jasmine had undoubtedly called them in a panic the moment she realized her fraudulent booking was frozen. I authorized the gate to open, walked into my living room, and braced myself for the storm. Less than 3 minutes later, heavy fists pounded against my front door. I did not even get the chance to turn the deadbolt completely before my father Derek pushed his way inside. He was wearing his tailored golf attire, his face flushed a deep, angry red. My mother Vivian followed closely behind him, her eyes immediately darting around my pristine living room looking for anything to judge. They did not ask how I was doing. They did not ask about Chloe, who was safely upstairs playing in her room, completely unaware of the monsters standing in our foyer. Derek marched right up to me and pointed a rigid finger directly in my face. His voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. "You are going to call that venue right now and fix whatever glitch you caused, Zora. I will not have you ruining your sister's wedding over your petty jealousy." I stood my ground, looking at the man who was supposed to protect me. "I did not cause a glitch, Dad," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Jasmine forged my signature on a corporate financial contract. She committed felony fraud to the tune of $150,000. Derek let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, dropping his hand. "Oh, please stop being so dramatic. She signed a piece of paper for a family favor. We paid for Jasmine's Spelman tuition in full, while you chose to go to a state school. We have invested everything into making sure she represents this family well. You owe this family for embarrassing us with your very public divorce 2 years ago. The least you can do is cover the venue cost and consider it your contribution to our legacy. Call them and authorize the payment." The absolute delusion in his words was staggering. He was equating my choice to attend a state school on a full academic scholarship with Jasmine's entitlement to a free ride at an expensive private college. He was using the most painful period of my life, my divorce from a man who was entirely wrong for me, as a weapon to force me into financing my sister's luxury lifestyle. He honestly believed that because I was a single mother, I owed a debt to the family for tarnishing their flawless upper-class image. "I will not be paying for a wedding I am not even welcome at," I replied, folding my arms across my chest. And I will certainly not be paying for it after my sister committed a federal crime to steal from my company. The booking remains frozen. Derek's face hardened into a mask of pure malice. He took another step forward, invading my personal space. "You listen to me very carefully," he growled. "If you do not pick up that phone and clear this balance, I will call my attorney today. I will sue you for breach of verbal family contract. You promised your mother you would help fund this wedding, and I will drag you through civil court until you are bankrupt." I almost laughed at the absurdity of his threat. A verbal family contract was not a real legal concept, and even if it were, I had never promised to pay for a single napkin at that wedding. But the threat was not meant to be legally sound. It was meant to intimidate me, to remind me that he had the resources to make my life a living hell. Before I could point out the flaw in his legal logic, Vivian stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on my father's arm. She looked at me with an expression so cold it made my blood run icy. Her voice was much quieter than Derek's, but infinitely more dangerous. "Your father is angry, Zora, but let us be reasonable," Vivian said, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. "We do not want to go to court, but you have to understand that your behavior lately has been very erratic. You are financially unstable, refusing to help your family, and you are raising Chloe in a broken home. If you insist on being difficult, Derek and I will have no choice but to file for grandparents' rights. We will petition the family court for full custody of Chloe. We will tell the judge that your financial instability and emotional outbursts make you an unfit mother. Do you really want to risk losing your daughter over a simple venue invoice?" The air in my lungs vanished. The room started to spin. My own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, was threatening to weaponize the legal system to steal my 8-year-old child. She was willing to destroy my entire world to rip my daughter from her home, just to ensure that Jasmine could drink vintage champagne in front of her white elitist in-laws. They would tear my family apart to preserve their aesthetic. I looked at Vivian and Derek, truly seeing them for the first time in my life. These were not parents. These were parasites. They fed on my compliance, and they would destroy the host if it stopped providing. If I argued, if I yelled or kicked them out, they would escalate. They had the money to hire ruthless lawyers who would drag my name through the mud and terrify Chloe. I needed them to leave my house thinking they had won. I needed them to feel completely, utterly victorious, so they would drop their guard. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my eyes to widen as if I was blinking back tears of defeat. I looked down at the hardwood floor, letting a long, shaky breath escape my lips. "Okay," I whispered, letting my voice tremble just enough to be convincing. "Okay, you win. Please, just do not involve the courts. I will not lose Chloe." Vivian smiled a sickeningly sweet expression of triumph. She reached out and patted my cheek as if I were a disobedient child who had finally learned her lesson. "See, that was not so hard, was it?" she cooed. "You just needed to be reminded of what is truly important. Now call the venue and unfreeze the booking. Know your place, Zora." I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing my corporate office number and putting it on speakerphone so they could hear every word. Malik answered on the second ring. "Malik, it is Zora." I said, my voice meek and defeated. "Please unfreeze the Grand Sterling booking for Jasmine. Push the authorization through." I could hear the absolute confusion in Malik's silence before his professional training kicked in. "Are you entirely sure, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," I said, looking directly into my father's smug eyes. "Push it through. Let them have exactly what they want." I hung up the phone. Derek nodded sharply, adjusting his golf shirt. "Good. We will see you at the rehearsal dinner. Try to look presentable." He turned and walked out the front door, Vivian following right behind him without another word. I stood in the foyer, listening to the sound of their car engine starting and fading down the street. The moment the sound disappeared, the facade of the broken, defeated daughter melted away entirely. I locked the deadbolt, walked into my home office, and immediately called my legal team. I did not just unfreeze the booking. I was setting a trap so lethal they would never see it coming. My lead corporate attorney answered immediately. I gave him his instructions with absolute clarity. Jasmine and Connor submitted that forged guarantor contract using the digital portal I explained, pacing behind my desk. When Connor paid the initial catering deposit last month, he had to link his primary financial accounts to the venue profile for liability purposes. He linked his family trust fund account. "I want you to accept the forged signature on the guarantor contract," I continued, "but I want you to activate the primary indemnity clause. Route the entire $150,000 financial liability directly to the primary account on file. Legally bind that forged debt straight to Connor's family trust fund." The attorney let out a low whistle over the phone, realizing exactly what I was doing. "If we do that, Zora, the moment the venue finalizes the billing next week, an automatic collections notice for a felony forged contract will be generated and sent directly to the trust fund manager. That is his father." I smiled a cold, ruthless smile that mirrored the one my mother had just given me. "I know," I said. "Make the changes. Make it ironclad." Jasmine and Connor wanted my company to foot the bill. My parents threatened to steal my child to force my compliance. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea that I had just quietly locked the door, lit the match, and tied the entire explosion directly to the one man Connor was absolutely terrified of. The countdown to the rehearsal dinner had officially begun. 2 days after the ambush in my living room, my phone vibrated with an incoming message. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing vendor contracts for the upcoming quarter when Jasmine's name flashed on the screen. She had sent an elaborately formatted digital itinerary for the rehearsal dinner, complete with silver cursive fonts and a strict formal dress code. Below the meticulously detailed schedule was a personal note that made my jaw tighten. "Thanks for finally acting like a supportive sister," the text read. "We saved a seat for you and Chloe at the back table near the kitchen doors, so you will not have to worry about mingling with Connor's relatives. It is better this way for everyone." I read the message twice, letting the absolute audacity of her words wash over me. She had forged my signature, committed a federal offense to steal $150,000 from my company, and she still felt entitled to put me in my place near the kitchen doors. I did not reply to her message. Silence is often the most terrifying response you can give to a narcissist because it gives them absolutely nothing to manipulate. I simply locked my phone and returned to my work. I had much bigger things to focus on than trading petty insults. I spent the next week operating in absolute stealth. My days were divided between managing my corporate portfolio, taking Chloe to her after-school activities, and quietly sharpening the blade that was about to drop on my family. If I was going to legally bind a massive fraudulent debt to Connor's family trust fund, I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with. I could not leave anything to chance. I reached out to a private investigator named Elias, whom I frequently used for high-level corporate background checks before acquiring new properties. I instructed Elias to look entirely past the carefully curated social media profiles, the country club memberships, and the luxury car leases. I needed to know exactly how Connor's finances were structured. I needed the architectural blueprints of his arrogance. 3 days later, Elias sat across from me in my downtown office, sliding a thick manila folder across the polished glass of my desk. What I read inside confirmed every single suspicion I had about the man my sister was so desperate to marry. Connor was not the brilliant self-made venture capitalist he paraded around Atlanta as. He was a complete financial illusion. He lived entirely off a strict monthly allowance distributed from a multi-generational family trust fund. That trust was tightly controlled by his father Charles, a man whose entire reputation in the financial sector was built on absolute ruthlessness and a zero-tolerance policy for impropriety. Charles had made his fortune in corporate compliance and auditing. The man despised liars, and he absolutely abhorred any form of financial fraud. According to Elias, Charles kept Connor on a notoriously short leash, reviewing his quarterly expenses with a microscope because Connor had a history of making terrible, irresponsible investments. This was the critical weakness in their entire plan. Connor had submitted the holding account details of his trust fund to the Grand Sterling months ago, assuming the venue would just charge his father for the initial catering deposits like they always did. But when Jasmine forged my signature to transfer the entire wedding balance, she inadvertently linked my corporate debt collection process directly to Charles. Once my venue finalized the billing, the system would automatically ping the trust for the full amount, triggering a massive fraud alert straight to the patriarch himself. Connor thought he had bullied me into submission, but he had essentially handed me the detonator to his own financial ruin. As Elias prepared to leave my office, he pulled a small digital audio recorder from his jacket pocket. He told me he had spent the previous afternoon having drinks at the same exclusive country club where Connor and Jasmine were enjoying a pre-wedding lunch. He placed the device on my desk and pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. I could hear the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the ambient murmur of the club patio. Then came Jasmine's voice, high-pitched and dripping with unearned superiority. She was laughing. "I am telling you, babe." She completely folded. Jasmine said, her voice echoing in my quiet office. "My dad threatened to sue her for custody of her kid and Zora just rolled over. She authorized the payment immediately." Then Connor's voice joined in, lazy and dripping with extreme condescension. "I told you we had nothing to worry about," Connor replied. "You just have to know how to handle these people." She was throwing a massive tantrum over a cheap birthday cake, but the second your dad put his foot down, she fell right in line. "It is pathetic, really." Jasmine giggled, a sound that made my stomach churn with disgust. "It is what it is," Jasmine said easily. "Thanks to my brilliant contract skills, the ghetto single mom is footing the bill for the wedding of the year. Now I just have to make sure she stays hidden near the kitchen so she does not ruin the aesthetic in front of your mother." I reached out and pressed a button to stop the recording. The silence in my office felt heavier now, thick with the reality of their malice. They were not just thoughtless or entitled. They were actively malicious. They viewed my daughter and me as nothing more than disposable assets, a bank account to be drained, and a punching bag to elevate their own fragile egos. The racial undertones of Connor's comments, the way Jasmine eagerly participated in the degradation of her own black sister just to secure her spot in a white old money family, was entirely sickening. But hearing those words also erased any lingering hesitation I might have had left in my heart. Any tiny whisper of guilt about destroying my sister's wedding evaporated the moment I heard her refer to me as the ghetto single mom footing the bill. I thanked Elias for his exceptional work and locked the audio file safely in my secure digital vault. I left the office early that afternoon to pick up Chloe from school. When she climbed into the back seat of my car, her face lit up with a bright, beautiful smile that instantly washed away the toxicity of my family. She started talking excitedly about an art project she had finished, completely untouched by the ugly class dynamics her aunt and grandparents were obsessed with. I looked at her through the rearview mirror and made a silent promise that I would never let those people make her feel small again. We drove to my personal tailor's boutique on the other side of town. My tailor was an incredible woman who had designed custom pieces for my most high-profile corporate galas. I told her exactly what I needed for the upcoming weekend. If Jasmine wanted me hidden near the kitchen to preserve her aesthetic, I was going to give her an aesthetic she could never hope to compete with. I ordered a breathtaking custom silk dress for Chloe in a deep, rich emerald green. For myself, I requested a sharply tailored designer suit in stark optic white, a deliberate power move for a wedding event. We were not going to arrive looking like the defeated relatives they expected. We were going to walk into that rehearsal dinner looking like the owners of the very ground they stood on, because we were. I spent the rest of the evening at home cooking dinner with my daughter and listening to her laugh. I felt a profound sense of calm settling over me. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the players were all moving exactly where I needed them to be. All I had to do now was wait for the curtain to rise. The following morning, the Atlanta sun was blindingly bright, mocking the dark undercurrents of the day. I dressed Chloe in her favorite outfit for the pre-wedding family brunch. It was a simple floral sundress paired with a vintage denim jacket we had found at a local thrift shop. Chloe had spent hours carefully sewing colorful patches onto the denim, proudly turning it into a wearable piece of art. To me, it was a testament to her creativity and bright spirit. To my family, it was a target. The brunch was held at an overly pretentious French bistro in Midtown, a place where the menu lacked prices and the waitstaff hovered like silent sentinels. I walked into the private dining room holding Chloe's hand, instantly feeling the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of performative wealth. The room was bathed in natural light, reflecting off crystal chandeliers and stark white table linens. Seated at the head of the long table was Connor's mother, an icy woman named Beatrice, who wore a frozen smile and a string of pearls that looked heavier than a steel chain. Jasmine and Vivian were flanking Beatrice, leaning in and laughing loudly at a joke that was not funny. Derek sat opposite Connor, nursing a mimosa and looking entirely too pleased with himself. When I walked in, the conversation abruptly halted. 7 pairs of eyes locked onto me and then immediately dropped to assess Chloe. I felt the collective temperature in the room plummet. I guided Chloe to the only 2 empty seats left at the far end of the table. We had barely sat down and unfolded our napkins before Jasmine launched her opening strike. Zora. I really thought you would have dressed up for today, Jasmine said, her voice carrying that sickeningly sweet tone she reserved for public insults. I mean, I know money is tight for you, but you could not find something a little more appropriate for a luxury venue. That jacket looks like it was pulled out of a donation bin. She gestured flippantly toward Chloe's proudly bedazzled, thrifted denim. Beatrice adjusted her pearls, leaning back in her chair and eyeing my daughter with open distaste. She let out a soft, disapproving sigh that cut through the quiet room. I felt Chloe's small hand tighten around mine beneath the tablecloth. She was young, but she was incredibly perceptive. She knew when she was being mocked. I squeezed her hand back, gently running my thumb over her knuckles to let her know she was safe. Before I could formulate a calm response, Vivian jumped in seamlessly, taking the baton from Jasmine to continue the public execution. You will have to excuse Zora, Beatrice, Vivian said, leaning toward her future-in-law with an expression of profound martyrdom. She is doing the best she can as a single mother. Financial instability takes a toll on one's refinement. We have tried to help her assimilate to our standards, but she insists on this rugged, independent lifestyle. It is terribly embarrassing, but family is family. Beatrice offered a tight, closed-mouth smile. Well, she murmured, her tone dripping with elite condescension. I suppose every family has its burden. It is very generous of you to include them, Vivian. Connor tells me Zora can be quite difficult to manage. They sat there sipping their overpriced champagne, bonding over my supposed destitution. They were painting me as the charity case, the broken branch on an otherwise perfect family tree. They wanted me to shrink. They wanted me to lower my eyes, apologize for my existence, and beg for their continued tolerance. In the past, the old Zora would have felt the familiar sting of tears pricking the back of her eyes. The old Zora would have felt a suffocating wave of shame. But the old Zora did not know about the forged corporate guarantor contract. The old Zora had not listened to a secret audio recording of these exact same people laughing at her, calling her a ghetto single mom, while simultaneously stealing $150,000 from her company. I looked at Jasmine and then at Vivian. I did not frown. I did not scowl. I let a slow, serene smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that genuinely unsettled people because it was the exact opposite of what they expected. You are absolutely right, Mom, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. I am doing the best I can. And Jasmine, the brunch is lovely. Thank you for making sure we had a seat at the table. Jasmine blinked, her smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. She exchanged a quick, confused glance with Connor. They had thrown their best insults at me in front of their most important audience, and I had absorbed it like water into a sponge. I did not give them the angry reaction they needed to justify their narrative. I simply agreed and smiled. Under the cover of the heavy white tablecloth, I pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and navigated to the text thread with my personal tailor. The green emerald silk for Chloe, and the optic white tailored suit for myself. I needed to ensure everything was perfectly aligned for the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. The outfits are flawless and ready for pickup. The tailor had messaged me earlier that morning. I typed back a quick response. Excellent. I will send my driver to collect them this afternoon. We will need them pressed and prepped. Tomorrow is going to be a very important night. I locked my phone and slid it back into my purse. The rest of the brunch was a masterclass in psychological endurance. I sat quietly helping Chloe cut her waffles and answering direct questions with brief, polite responses. I watched Jasmine perform for Beatrice, changing her laugh, adjusting her posture, and desperately trying to mold herself into the perfect high society daughter-in-law. I watched Connor play the role of the wealthy benefactor, magnanimously allowing his poor sister-in-law to eat at his table. They were all playing characters in a play they thought they had written. They had no idea I owned the theater. As the agonizing 2-hour brunch finally came to a close, the table erupted in a flurry of fake hugs and exaggerated air kisses. Vivian wrapped her arms around Beatrice, promising to call her later to finalize the seating charts. Derek shook Connor's hand, clapping him on the shoulder like a proud father. I helped Chloe put her colorful denim jacket back on, making sure to tell her how beautiful she looked loud enough for Beatrice to hear. I was guiding Chloe toward the exit when I felt a hard, aggressive grip on my upper arm. I stopped, turning to see Connor standing uncomfortably close. He had waited until Jasmine and my parents were distracted near the valet stand to intercept me. His face was devoid of the charming smile he had worn for the past 2 hours. His eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply hostile. "Listen to me, Zora," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "My father is flying in tonight, and he will be at the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. Charles does not tolerate messes, and he does not tolerate embarrassments. You got lucky today because my mother is polite, but do not push it." He squeezed my arm slightly tighter, his fingers digging into my blazer. "You stay at the back table with your kid. You do not speak to my father. You do not mingle with his colleagues. We do not need you ruining our aesthetic or bringing your ghetto drama to his attention. You are only here because Jasmine pitied you. Do your job, stay invisible, and keep your mouth shut. Do we understand each other?" I looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. He was standing so close I could smell the expensive cologne he likely bought with his monthly trust fund allowance. He was trying to intimidate me using his physical presence and his father's reputation to force me into submission. He thought his father Charles was a shield that protected him from the consequences of the real world. He did not know that his father's strict zero-tolerance policy for financial fraud was the exact weapon I was currently aiming at his head. I did not pull my arm away. I did not flinch. I let that same serene, icy smile return to my lips. It was a smile born from absolute, ultimate leverage. "I understand perfectly, Connor," I said, my voice practically a purr. "You want everything to go smoothly with Charles. You want him to see exactly what kind of man you are and exactly what kind of family you are marrying into." Connor narrowed his eyes, clearly unsettled by my lack of fear. He released my arm, taking a half step back. "Just stay away from him," he muttered. I smoothed the fabric of my blazer where his fingers had wrinkled it. "Oh, you do not have to worry about me ruining the aesthetic, Connor. I would not dream of staying invisible tomorrow night. In fact, I have a very special presentation planned just for your father. I think he is going to find my contribution to this wedding incredibly illuminating." I turned my back on him, taking Chloe's hand and walking out the glass doors of the bistro into the warm Atlanta afternoon. I did not look back, but I could feel Connor's eyes burning into my spine. The pieces were locked into place. The financial liability was legally bound to the trust. The evidence of their fraud was securely stored in my vault. Tomorrow night, the illusion would end, and the devastation would begin. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived with a heavy, humid warmth typical of Georgia in the late summer. I pulled my car into the private underground garage of the Grand Sterling estate, bypassing the main valet entrance entirely. Walking through the polished service corridors, I felt the familiar hum of my flagship property coming to life. The Grand Sterling was a masterpiece of modern luxury architecture, featuring soaring vaulted ceilings, imported marble columns, and crystal fixtures that caught the morning light like crushed diamonds. This was the empire my family thought they were too good for, yet simultaneously felt entitled to steal. I walked into the main ballroom where the catering staff was already arranging the long banquet tables for the evening. The space was breathtaking, designed to seat 300 guests in absolute opulence. Tonight, it would hold only 50 of Connor's most elite relatives and my deeply delusional family members. I traced my fingers along the edge of a gold-rimmed charger plate, taking a deep breath of the floral-scented air. Everything had to be flawless. My family had constantly belittled my state school education, praising Jasmine's expensive Spelman tuition. They assumed my lack of a prestige degree meant a lack of ambition. They did not realize that being stripped of their financial support had cultivated a ruthless hunger inside me, a hunger that built the very walls they were about to dine within. Malik was waiting for me near the grand sweeping staircase, holding a thick leather-bound clipboard and flanked by two senior members of our audiovisual team. His usual pristine uniform was crisp, and his expression was dead serious. We walked together toward the elevated control booth, situated discreetly behind the balcony tier overlooking the entire ballroom. The AV team had already begun running high-definition fiber optic cables linking the massive drop-down projector screens directly to a secured local network. I handed Malik my personal tablet. The screens needed to mirror this device instantly on my command, without any lag buffering or technical delays. The lead technician confirmed the synchronization, demonstrating how a single tap on my screen would override the ambient background visuals and project my display across all four walls of the ballroom in stunning 4K resolution. As the technicians returned to their intricate wiring work, Malik leaned against the control desk, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He flipped open his clipboard, looking once more at the copy of the forged corporate guarantor contract Jasmine and Connor had submitted. "They really kicked you out at 20 with absolutely nothing." "Zora," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and protective loyalty. "You built this entire hospitality empire from the ground up, working 100-hour weeks, bleeding for every single inch of ground you took. You sacrificed everything to make Apex Pinnacle a powerhouse, and they still look at you and think they can step on you like you are nothing." I looked out over the ballroom floor, picturing my parents walking into this space tonight, believing they had conquered it. I remembered the night they threw me out, tossing my cheap suitcases onto the wet driveway, because I refused to follow their rigid path. I remembered Jasmine standing in the doorway, watching me shiver in the rain, with that exact same smug smile she wore at the bistro. "They are about to learn what stepping on a landmine feels like," I replied. My voice was steady, completely void of any fear or hesitation. Once the audiovisual sync was perfected, I requested our head of venue security to join us in the ballroom. Marcus was a towering ex-military professional who ran my security teams with absolute precision and zero tolerance for nonsense. He knew exactly who was arriving tonight, and he understood the highly sensitive nature of the evening. We stood by the massive mahogany double doors that served as the primary entrance and exit to the grand ballroom. "Marcus, I need absolute containment tonight," I instructed, looking him dead in the eye. "When the formal dinner concludes and the champagne is poured for the traditional family toasts, I want these main doors secured from the outside. No staff enters, and absolutely no guests leave." Marcus crossed his massive arms, giving a firm, single nod. He did not ask questions. He simply processed the tactical logistics. "What about the kitchen service corridors?" he asked, gesturing toward the hidden swinging doors behind the head table. "Lock them down," I confirmed. "Reroute the waitstaff to the secondary holding areas. I do not want any cross-traffic once the presentation begins. If Connor or my father tries to make a swift exit, they will find every single avenue blocked. They are going to sit in their assigned seats, and they are going to watch exactly what they have done, broadcasted for every elite trust fund manager and country club socialite in that room to see." Marcus tapped his earpiece, confirming the protocol with his team on the ground. "The lockdown will be initiated exactly on your signal, Ms. Wilson," he assured me. We spent the next 2 hours running aggressive drills. We practiced the lighting cues, ensuring the massive crystal chandeliers would dim to a dramatic low glow the exact second my tablet synced to the projectors. We tested the audio levels, making sure the crystal-clear recording of Connor and Jasmine laughing at the country club would echo through the high-end surround sound speakers with deafening, undeniable clarity. Every variable was accounted for. Every escape route was sealed tight. I was treating this rehearsal dinner not as a family celebration but as a hostile corporate takeover. Satisfied that the Grand Sterling was primed and ready to execute my commands, I returned to my townhouse to prepare for the evening. The air in my home felt electric, charged with the heavy anticipation of the coming storm. I found Chloe in her bedroom, excitedly looking at the garment bag my driver had delivered from the tailor. The time for thrifted denim jackets and hiding in the shadows was officially over. I carefully unzipped the heavy canvas bag, revealing the masterpiece inside. Chloe gasped, her eyes widening as I pulled out the custom silk dress. I had specifically requested the designer to make it a rich, vibrant emerald green, the exact color of the Princess Tiana cake Vivian and Jasmine had thrown into the garbage. It was a silent reclamation of her joy. The fabric caught the late afternoon light, shimmering like liquid glass. The cut was elegant and sophisticated, entirely age-appropriate, but undeniably expensive and luxurious. As I helped her slip it on and button the back, she twirled in front of her vanity mirror. The skirt flared out perfectly, and a massive bright smile took over her face. She looked like absolute royalty. I retreated to my own room to don my armor. I pulled the optic white tailored suit from its hanger, running my hands over the flawless wool blend fabric. I slipped into the high-waisted trousers and buttoned the sharp asymmetrical blazer. The stark white was a highly deliberate choice. Wearing white to a wedding event when you were not the bride was the ultimate social insult in their circles. In a sea of muted cocktail dresses and safe conservative evening wear, I was going to be an unmissable beacon of power and defiance. I paired the crisp suit with a simple gold choker and emerald earrings that perfectly matched Chloe's dress. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe bun, ensuring there were no distractions from my face. I stood in front of my floor-to-length mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman who had survived a lifetime of emotional starvation. I thought about the smashed cake in the trash bin. I thought about Derek pointing his finger in my face, threatening to sue me for breach of a fictional family contract. I thought about Vivian smiling sweetly while threatening to rip my child away from me if I did not finance her golden child's luxury aesthetic. I thought about Connor gripping my arm in the bistro parking lot, demanding I stay hidden near the kitchen doors so I would not embarrass him in front of his wealthy father. They had spent decades writing the script of my life, casting me as the tragic failure, the disposable stepping stone, and the bitter outcast. They demanded my money while simultaneously demanding my silence. Tonight, I was taking the pen away from them. I grabbed my clutch, ensuring my tablet was fully charged and securely tucked inside. Chloe walked into my bedroom, her little emerald dress swishing around her knees. "Are we ready to go to the fancy dinner, Mommy?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent excitement. I knelt down to her level, adjusting the delicate collar of her dress and smiling a genuine, fearless smile. "We are absolutely ready, my love," I said. I stood up, taking her hand in mine and walking toward the front door. The sun was beginning to set over Atlanta, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. The trap was set, the evidence was loaded, and the doors were ready to be locked. It was time for war. The tires of my black SUV glided silently over the imported cobblestone of the Grand Sterling Estate driveway. The night air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive perfume. Golden uplighting illuminated the massive marble columns of the main entrance, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable wealth. The valet, a young man named David, whom I had personally hired, bounded over to open my door. I stepped out onto the pristine walkway, the optic white wool blend of my tailored suit catching the ambient light like a spotlight. I reached back and helped Chloe out of the car. Her emerald green silk dress cascaded perfectly around her knees, shimmering brilliantly against the backdrop of the night. We did not look like the discarded, struggling relatives my family desperately wanted us to be. We looked like the owners of the estate, because we were. As we walked up the grand sweeping staircase toward the main ballroom doors, heads began to turn. Wealthy socialites and trust fund heirs paused mid-conversation, their champagne flutes hovering near their lips as they took in the sight. I kept my posture rigid, my chin high, and my expression completely serene. Chloe held my hand tightly, walking with a quiet confidence that made my chest swell with pride. We barely made it through the heavy mahogany double doors before the frantic clicking of heels echoed across the foyer. My mother Vivian practically sprinted across the Italian tile, her face contorted into a mask of pure panic and rage. She wore a heavy beaded gown that looked entirely too restrictive for the humid evening, but her grip when she grabbed my forearm was like a steel vise. "What do you think you are doing, Vivian?" hissed her voice, a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. She deliberately positioned her body to block me from the view of the main dining floor. Her eyes darted frantically over my pristine white suit and Chloe's custom silk dress. "I told you to be presentable, not to treat your sister's rehearsal dinner like your own personal fashion show." She snapped her nails, digging through the fabric of my sleeve. "You are wearing white Zora. Are you out of your mind? You are making Jasmine look bad. Get to the back right now. The service hallway is on the left. You and the child need to sit near the kitchen where you belong." She tried to physically shove me backward, attempting to force me out of the main entrance and toward the hidden service doors used by the catering staff. This was her signature move. Whenever I achieved something she could not control, she shoved me into the shadows. When I won my state debate championship in high school, she refused to let me put the trophy on the mantle because it would make Jasmine's cheerleading medals look small. When I landed my full academic scholarship, she conveniently forgot to tell the extended family, framing my departure as a desperate escape rather than a triumph. She had spent a lifetime treating me like a shameful secret to be hidden behind the kitchen doors. I did not budge. I planted my expensive heels firmly into the tile and stared down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me. "Take your hand off me, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. Before my mother could escalate her physical assault, a deep, resonant voice cut through the tension. "Good evening, ma'am." Malik materialized from the bustling crowd of waitstaff. He was dressed in his immaculate tuxedo, his posture exuding absolute authority. He stepped smoothly between me and my mother, seamlessly breaking her grip on my arm without ever breaking his professional demeanor. He did not even look at Vivian. He treated her as if she were an overly aggressive guest who had wandered too close to the VIP section. "Right this way, ma'am," Malik said, addressing me with a slight deferential bow. "Your table is prepared." Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her chest in sheer outrage. "Excuse me," she sputtered, turning her fury onto Malik. "You are just a maitre d'. You do not tell us where to go. She belongs at the back table. I am the mother of the bride, and I demand you take her to the service section immediately." Malik finally turned his gaze to Vivian. His expression was completely blank, an impenetrable wall of professional indifference. "The seating arrangements have been finalized by the owner of the estate, madame." He replied, his tone perfectly polite, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of finality. "Please enjoy your evening." He extended his arm, guiding Chloe and me forward. Vivian was left standing in the foyer, her mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. She was entirely powerless here, and the sudden realization of that fact left her paralyzed. I walked into the main ballroom with Malik leading the way. The space was magnificent. The crystal chandeliers were dimmed to a warm amber glow, reflecting off the polished silver and towering floral arrangements. As we moved past the crowded tables, the quiet murmurs of the guests swelled into a noticeable wave of whispers. I saw Jasmine's bridesmaids sitting near the front, their mouths dropping open as they took in my white tailored suit. They nudged each other, exchanging shocked glances. Then I saw the head table. Connor was sitting rigidly, his face draining of color, the moment he saw me walking past the kitchen doors he had so aggressively assigned to me. Beside him sat a man who could only be Charles, his father. Charles possessed the kind of quiet, terrifying authority that did not require loud voices or flashy clothes. He sat with his hands steepled, watching my entrance with sharp, calculating eyes. He was analyzing every detail of the room, every micro-expression. And I knew instantly why Connor was so terrified of him. Malik did not stop at the back of the room. He did not stop in the middle. He escorted Chloe and me directly to the absolute best VIP table in the entire ballroom. It was a raised, semicircular booth, draped in heavy velvet, positioned perfectly in the center of the room, with an unobstructed view of both the head table and the massive projector screens hovering above. Malik pulled out my chair, offering a discreet nod as I sat down. Chloe climbed into the plush seat beside me, her eyes wide with wonder at the beautiful surroundings. I smoothed the napkin over my lap, feeling the collective stare of 50 elite guests burning into my skin. Connor's family was watching in utter confusion, trying to reconcile the image of the destitute ghetto sister they had been warned about with the powerful woman commanding the center of the room. Derek had finally made his way into the ballroom, spotting Vivian near the entrance, and following her frantic gesturing toward my table. I watched my father's face contort into a mask of pure suppressed rage as he realized I had completely defied his orders. He took a step toward my table, his fists clenching, but halted when he noticed Charles watching him closely. Derek cared far too much about looking refined in front of the wealthy in-laws to cause a public scene. He was trapped by his own desperate need for approval. The atmosphere in this ballroom was thick with unspoken hostility. I calmly ordered a sparkling water for Chloe and a glass of vintage Pinot Noir for myself. I did not look at my phone. I did not check my tablet. I knew Marcus and the security team were currently positioning themselves by the main exit doors, waiting for my signal. Everything was moving exactly according to the meticulous timeline I had established. At the head table, Jasmine was trembling with absolute fury. Her hands were gripping the edges of the table so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She had spent the entire day preparing to be the center of the universe, the undisputed star of her luxury fantasy. She had expected me to cower in the shadows dressed in cheap clothes, hiding my face in shame while she paraded her wealth. Instead, I had walked in and effortlessly commanded the attention of every single person in her orbit. I could see her whispering frantically to Connor, who was desperately trying to hush her, while casting nervous glances at his father. Charles leaned over, murmuring something to Connor that made the younger man flinch visibly. The pressure was mounting, and Jasmine simply lacked the psychological endurance to handle it. She needed to assert her dominance. She needed to remind everyone in the room that she was the golden child, and I was just the tragic charity case who had to be tolerated. Jasmine abruptly stood up, pushing her chair back with a loud scrape against the marble floor. She grabbed her champagne flute and snatched the wireless microphone from its stand on the table. The sudden screech of audio feedback cut through the ambient music, silencing the room instantly. Waitstaff paused in their tracks. Guests turned their chairs toward the head table. Jasmine stood there, her face flushed a dark blotchy red with jealousy and rage. She gripped the microphone, staring directly across the ballroom at me. Her fake sweet smile was plastered onto her face, but her eyes were wild and malicious. She raised her glass, ready to deliver her rehearsal dinner toast, ready to publicly humiliate me and put me back in my place. The piercing screech of audio feedback faded into the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. 50 pairs of eyes remained glued to the head table where Jasmine stood. She tapped the microphone with a manicured finger, clearing her throat to ensure she had absolute attention. She looked down at Connor, her eyes fluttering with a manufactured, adoring gaze that looked like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror for weeks. Then she swept her gaze across the room, taking in the affluent crowd of corporate executives, trust fund heirs, and country club socialites. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," Jasmine began, her voice dripping with an artificial sugary sweetness that made my teeth ache. She spent the first 10 minutes of her speech performing a masterful act of social climbing. She fawned endlessly over Connor's parents, praising Charles for his unparalleled business acumen, and Beatrice for her impeccable, refined taste. She bowed at the altar of their generational wealth, speaking about how incredibly blessed she felt to be welcomed into a family with such a rich, distinguished legacy, carefully omitting the fact that our own parents were sitting just a few feet away, practically salivating for a drop of that same validation. Then the inevitable shift occurred. The sweet, gracious bride facade tightened into something far more predatory. Jasmine turned her body, slightly directing the entire room's attention away from the head table and pointing it squarely at my VIP booth in the dead center of the ballroom. Her smile sharpened the edges, lifting into a cruel, calculated smirk. But tonight, I also want to take a special moment to acknowledge my own family, she said, letting her voice drop into a tone of deep, condescending pity. Specifically, my older sister Zora. The ballroom remained completely silent, but the atmospheric pressure shifted violently. I felt the collective gaze of the room lock onto me. As many of you know, Jasmine continued projecting her voice, so it echoed off the marble columns. Zora has had a very difficult few years. Being a struggling single mother is not an easy path, and our family has worried so much about her financial stability since her unfortunate divorce. It takes a severe toll on a person. She let out a soft, breathy sigh, shaking her head in a perfect display of theatrical sorrow. But despite her hardships, despite everything she lacks, Zora scraped together her pennies to help out with a small portion of tonight's venue costs, so we would not be embarrassed. She wanted to feel included. It just goes to show that even when you have practically nothing, you can still learn to give to those who truly matter. The silence that followed her words was absolutely suffocating. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Under the guise of a gracious bridal toast, she had just publicly branded me as a destitute, divorced charity case who had to empty her meager savings just to buy a seat at the table. A few polite, deeply uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd of Connor's elite relatives. They turned to look at my white tailored suit and Chloe's emerald dress, their eyes swimming with thinly veiled pity and outright disdain. They saw exactly what Jasmine commanded them to see, a desperate woman allowed into the room purely out of familial obligation. I glanced at my parents' table. Derek raised his wine glass toward Jasmine, his chest puffed out with immense pride. Beside him, Vivian was practically glowing, beaming at her youngest daughter's display of manufactured superiority. They were absolutely thrilled. They thought Jasmine had just successfully neutralized the threat of my presence by publicly defining my narrative before I could even speak. They believed they had won. At the head table, Connor was leaning back in his chair, a look of absolute triumph plastered across his face. He caught my eye and offered a slow, mocking smirk, completely secure in the knowledge that he had put the ghetto single mom back in her place. But my eyes drifted past Connor and landed on his father. Charles was not smiling. The ruthless patriarch of the family trust fund sat perfectly upright, his hands steepled beneath his chin. His sharp, calculating eyes darted between Jasmine's triumphant face and my entirely serene posture. He was a man who destroyed companies for a living. He understood power dynamics on a molecular level, and he could clearly sense that the energy in this room was violently misaligned. He was watching me like a hawk waiting for the prey to move. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lower my head in shame, to flush red with embarrassment, or perhaps storm out of the ballroom in a fit of emotional tears, cementing my role as the unstable, jealous sibling. Instead, I remained completely, perfectly still. I did not break eye contact with Jasmine. I slowly reached for a linen napkin and gently wiped a stray crumb of bread from Chloe's cheek. My beautiful daughter looked up at me, her big brown eyes questioning the sudden heavy attention of the room. "Eat your dessert, sweetie," I murmured softly, my voice calm and reassuring. "Mommy has to go to work now." I placed the napkin neatly on the table. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus, my head of security, standing by the massive mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom. As soon as my hands left the table, Marcus gave a sharp nod. I heard the heavy metallic click of the deadbolts engaging. The ballroom doors were officially locked from the outside. No one was leaving until the show was over. I picked up a heavy silver spoon from my place setting. With deliberate, measured precision, I tapped it against the rim of my crystal water glass. Ding, ding, ding. The sharp, resonant chime cut through the murmuring crowd like a physical blade. The polite chatter instantly died. Every single eye in the grand ballroom snapped back to me as I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored white blazer. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, predatory grace of a woman who owned the very floorboards beneath her feet. The optic white fabric of my suit caught the amber glow of the chandeliers, a stark, undeniable contrast to the shadows they had tried to banish me to. The rhythmic, echoing click of my heels against the imported marble was the only sound in the massive room. I watched the smug satisfaction drain out of Jasmine's face with every step I took toward the head table. Her smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously toward our parents. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing red as he realized I was not following their script. Vivian hissed something under her breath, trying to catch my eye, but I stared straight ahead, completely ignoring her existence. Connor's mocking smirk vanished, replaced by a look of rising panic. He abruptly sat forward, gripping the edge of the table. He glanced desperately at his father, but Charles did not look at him. Charles was entirely focused on me, his expression shifting from observant curiosity to intense anticipation. I reached the head table and stepped directly onto the elevated platform, invading Jasmine's personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was sharp, barely masking the underlying sweat of her sudden, paralyzing anxiety. Her hand was visibly trembling as she gripped the wireless microphone. She tried to maintain her fake sweet smile, but her eyes were wide with genuine terror. She had launched her best attack, and it had bounced off me like paper. I did not ask for permission. I did not wait for her to finish speaking. I reached out and wrapped my fingers firmly around the microphone, sliding it effortlessly from her shaking grasp. Jasmine stepped back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, completely powerless to stop me in front of her new family. I turned my back to her, facing the room of wealthy socialites, trust fund managers, and my horrified parents. I held the microphone perfectly still, letting my eyes sweep across the crowd. I looked at Vivian, whose face had gone chalk white. I looked at Derek, who was gripping his wine glass so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. And finally I locked dead into Jasmine's terrified eyes. "I think it is time," I said, my voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system with crystal clear, unyielding authority. We cleared up a few financial misunderstandings. I stood on the elevated platform, the cold metal of the microphone resting comfortably in my hand. The harsh screech of the audio feedback had faded, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. 50 pairs of eyes remained glued to the head table, waiting for the punchline of a joke they did not fully understand. Jasmine stared at me, her mouth slightly ajar, waiting for me to apologize, to break, to scurry back to the shadows where she had spent her entire life, trying to confine me. She expected a tearful outburst. She expected the broken, desperate girl she remembered. I gave her absolute, terrifying precision. "I did not scrape together pennies, Jasmine," I said, my voice echoing off the imported marble columns and crystal chandeliers, steady, clear, and utterly lethal. "I own this venue." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I watched the cognitive dissonance physically strike my sister. For 20 years, Jasmine had wielded our parents' favoritism like a club, beating down my achievements to elevate her own. She had built her entire identity on being the better, more successful sister. Now, standing under the glaring light of my reality, that identity was evaporating. Her eyes darted frantically around the ballroom, searching the faces of the waitstaff, looking at the soaring vaulted ceilings, and finally dropping back down to my optic white tailored suit. She was searching for a camera, a sign that this was a cruel prank, but there was only the cold, hard certainty of my unblinking stare. What are you talking about?" Jasmine stammered, her voice stripped of its previous sugary confidence. She sounded incredibly small, her hands trembling so violently that her heavy diamond engagement ring caught the light in erratic flashes. The shockwave rippled through the room with physical force. The ambient clinking of crystal champagne flutes and silver cutlery stopped entirely. A wealthy socialite at table 4 actually dropped her fork, the sharp clatter ringing out like a gunshot in the silent room. I shifted my gaze to my parents' table. Vivian looked as though she had been struck by lightning. The blood had completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly shaking. She gripped the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles stark white, her mouth forming a silent, horrified denial. Derek, who had spent the last decade bragging about his unmatched business acumen and his superior financial instincts, looked utterly dismantled. He had called me a disappointment. He had threatened to sue me for custody of my own daughter. Now he was sitting at a table I paid for drinking wine I had selected, realizing that his discarded, disgraced daughter had built the most exclusive hospitality empire in Atlanta without a single dime of his money. The truth was breaking his mind in real time. Connor sat frozen at the head table. His previous arrogant smirk had mutated into a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. He looked at the opulent floral centerpieces, the imported silk linens, the silver-tiered trays of expensive catering, suddenly realizing whose roof he was sitting under. He knew exactly what he had submitted to my finance department. The trap he thought he had laid for me was actually a cage he had built for himself. "You do not own the Grand Sterling," Jasmine hissed desperately, trying to reclaim her narrative, leaning in so the microphone would not pick up her venomous whisper. "You are lying. You are just a struggling designer. Mom and Dad said so. You are trying to ruin my wedding." "Mom and Dad say a lot of things," I replied smoothly, lifting the microphone back to my mouth so the entire room could hear every single syllable. "But numbers, unlike our parents, do not lie." I pulled my personal tablet from my clutch. Without breaking eye contact with my sister, I tapped the secure application icon linked to the audiovisual control booth. Above us, the ambient string quartet music abruptly cut off. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the ballroom as the massive high-definition media screens began their descent from the vaulted ceiling. The elegant amber lighting of the crystal chandeliers immediately dimmed to a dramatic low glow, plunging the room into shadows save for the glaring, brilliant light of the screens unrolling across all four walls. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. This was not the charming photo montage of childhood memories or romantic engagement shoots they were expecting. I did not project photos of the happy couple. I projected a highly magnified, crystal-clear scan of a commercial contract. At the very top of the massive screens, in bold, undeniable black letters read the header, "Apex Pinnacle Hospitality Group, Corporate Guarantor Agreement." The document outlined a $150,000 liability contract for this exact wedding weekend. I tapped my screen again, zooming in on the second page. The projector highlighted the routing details, showing the exact financial pipeline linking the venue's billing department directly to the Sterling Family Trust Fund. "What is this?" Vivian shrieked, finally breaking her paralysis. She half stood from her chair, her beaded gown rustling loudly. "Zora, turn those screens off immediately. You are ruining your sister's night. Marcus, get her out of here." She looked toward the back of the room, expecting the security team to rush forward and drag me away. But Marcus stood completely still, his arms crossed over his massive chest, blocking the locked mahogany doors. He did not take orders from Vivian. He took orders from the owner. "I am simply providing the financial transparency Jasmine so desperately wanted to discuss," I answered, my voice slicing through my mother's panic. I gestured toward the massive screens illuminating the room. "This is a corporate guarantor contract. It is a legally binding agreement stating that if the bride and groom fail to pay the remaining balance for this luxury weekend, my parent company, Apex Pinnacle, will absorb the debt and automatically bill the linked accounts. It is a very standard hospitality contract for high-net-worth events. However, there is a severe catastrophic problem with this specific document." I walked slowly along the edge of the elevated platform, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to marinate in their exposure. I could hear Jasmine breathing heavily, her chest heaving as the reality of her actions was broadcasted in 4K resolution. I watched the socialites, whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting from the forged signature to Jasmine's pale face. In their world, wealth was respected, but power was feared. I was demonstrating both. I tapped my tablet one final time. The screens zoomed in on the bottom of the last page, focusing entirely on the signature line. There, blown up to 10 feet tall for every elite trust fund manager, corporate lawyer, and country club socialite to see, was my name, Zora Wilson, forged in a messy, panicked cursive. Beside it was the authorized countersignature of Connor Charles Sterling. "I never signed this document," I stated, the words falling like heavy hammer strikes in the dark room. "My signature was forged by the bride." Frantic whispers erupted across the ballroom. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were no strangers to scandal, but financial fraud committed against a venue owner at her own property broadcasted during a rehearsal dinner was a level of audacity they had never witnessed. Guests began leaning in, pointing at the screens, reading the clauses for themselves. Connor bolted up from his chair, knocking his crystal water glass over. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody cared. "Turn it off!" he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "Zora, shut it down right now, or I swear to God." He took a step towards me, but stopped dead in his tracks. From the shadows near the entrance, two members of my security team stepped forward, their presence a silent, terrifying warning. Connor swallowed hard, realizing he was entirely trapped. The doors were locked. The evidence was glaring. There was nowhere to run. I ignored his outburst and turned my attention directly to the center of the head table. Charles Sterling had not moved. He had not blinked, and he had not spoken a single word. The ruthless patriarch of the family trust fund sat perfectly upright, his hands steepled beneath his chin. His sharp, calculating eyes were locked onto the massive screens above him, reading the liability clauses, analyzing the routing numbers, and scrutinizing the forged signatures with the cold, brutal efficiency of a corporate titan. He was a man whose entire reputation was built on strict compliance and financial integrity. He despised liars, and he actively destroyed anyone who brought scandal to his name. Slowly, Charles lowered his hands and shifted his gaze from the screen down to me. He did not look at his panicking son. He did not look at his horrified future daughter-in-law. He looked directly at the woman holding the microphone. I held his gaze, matching his intense, unyielding stare. The old Zora would have withered under the weight of his attention. The new Zora thrived in it. "Your son and my sister did not just book a venue, Charles," I said, projecting my voice so it rang clear, steady, and utterly devastating across the locked ballroom. "They committed felony identity theft to fund this wedding." The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound you could hear the soft mechanical hum of the projector cooling fans above us. I kept my eyes locked on Jasmine, watching the remaining color completely drained from her cheeks. She was paralyzed, the wireless microphone slipping from her hands and resting safely in mine. I turned my body slightly so I could address the entire room of 50 elite guests, while still keeping the head table firmly in my peripheral vision. I raised my free hand and gestured gracefully toward the massive glowing screens behind us. "For those of you who may not be familiar with commercial hospitality contracts, let me walk you through exactly what you are looking at." I began, my tone conversational yet laced with lethal precision. 3 months ago, my sister Jasmine and her fiancé Connor booked this magnificent estate for their wedding weekend. The Grand Sterling requires a substantial deposit for exclusive events of this caliber. However, Jasmine and Connor did not want to pay that deposit up front. Instead, they opted for a corporate guarantor agreement. This is a very convenient loophole that allows a high-net-worth corporate entity to vouch for the entire cost of the event, promising to absorb any unpaid debts. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the affluent crowd. The corporate executives and lawyers in the room were already nodding along, their eyes fixed on the projected documents. They understood exactly where this was going. The corporate entity they chose to leverage was Apex Pinnacle Hospitality Group. I continued tapping my tablet to highlight the company letterhead on the screen. It is a highly respected firm. The problem, however, is that Apex Pinnacle did not agree to sponsor this wedding. Jasmine saw an opportunity. She assumed I was merely a low-level employee, a struggling single mother working in middle management at the holding company. She assumed I was desperate and easily intimidated. So she simply forged my name on the guarantor line, assuming I would take the fall and be too terrified of our parents to ever speak up. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. I saw a prominent real estate developer at table 3 physically recoil, his hand covering his mouth. Corporate fraud was not just a scandal in these circles, it was social and professional suicide. Jasmine gripped the edge of the table, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She looked toward our parents for rescue, but Vivian and Derek were frozen in their seats. Vivian looked as though she had been physically struck by lightning, her jaw hanging slack as she stared at the 10-foot-tall projection of her youngest daughter's felony. Derek was violently pale, his entire carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbling into dust. "I did not scrape together pennies, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I did not empty my savings to buy a seat at your table so you would not be embarrassed. I did not help out. I own Apex Pinnacle. I own the Grand Sterling. I own this venue." The room went dead silent. The ambient clinking of silverware, the rustling of expensive fabrics, the polite murmurs, all of it ceased to exist. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. The guests stared at me, their expressions rapidly morphing from thinly veiled pity to absolute stunned awe. They had spent the last 20 minutes looking at me as a charity case. Now they realized they were sitting in my house, drinking my wine and breathing my air. Jasmine took a stumbling step backward, her designer heels catching on the carpeted platform. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "That is impossible. You are lying. You do not own anything." Before I could respond, Connor leaped out of his chair. His face was a mask of furious panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "She is a liar!" he shouted desperately, trying to seize control of a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is a bitter, jealous psycho. She has always hated Jasmine, and she is just trying to extort us for cash. This is a complete mix-up with the venue billing department. Get security in here and throw her out right now." Connor looked frantically toward the back doors, expecting my security team to rush forward and drag me into the night. Instead, Marcus and his men stood like statues, their arms crossed, their faces impassive, guarding the locked exits. Connor swallowed hard, the terrifying reality of his total containment finally crashing down upon him. I let him finish his outburst. I let the echo of his panicked screaming fade into the high vaulted ceilings, highlighting his sheer desperation. Then I tapped my tablet a second time. The massive screens behind me transitioned instantly. The forged corporate guarantor contract vanished, replaced by a highly detailed financial routing document. I had redacted the sensitive account numbers, but the primary headers were bold and unmistakable. The name of the Sterling Family Trust flashed in bright red letters across the digital displays. I turned my body completely away from Jasmine and focused my attention solely on the man who had just called me a liar. "You see, Connor," I said, my tone analytical and devoid of any emotion, "when you demanded I pay the invoice to save your precious aesthetic yesterday, you made a fatal miscalculation. You assumed the venue would simply process the forged corporate paperwork and quietly absorb the cost. But because Jasmine forged a chief executive officer's signature, the liability automatically escalated from a standard unpaid invoice to corporate wire fraud." Connor's face turned an ashen gray. He staggered slightly, bumping into the table behind him, causing a water pitcher to wobble dangerously. "And Connor," I continued, my voice rising to ensure every single person in the room heard the absolute finality of my next statement, "when you submitted the final venue authorizations, you did not realize I had already personally supervised the billing architecture. I did not cancel the fraudulent contract. I simply rerouted it. I have already legally tied this forged $150,000 debt directly to your family's trust fund." A sharp collective intake of breath swept the room. Trust fund managers and venture capitalists in the crowd began whispering furiously to one another, pointing at the routing screens. They knew exactly what that meant. The venue software had already pinged the trust. The fraud alert had already been registered. Connor had not just stolen from me, he had triggered a massive, uncontainable financial breach within his own family's protected assets. At the center of the head table, the ultimate authority finally moved. Charles Sterling pushed his chair back. The scraping sound was deafening. He stood up slowly, his imposing frame dominating the space around him. The man who controlled billions of dollars, the man who despised liars and financial impropriety above all else, looked as though he was about to spontaneously combust. His face was a deep, terrifying shade of purple. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. He did not look at the screaming crowd or the whispering socialites. He marched directly toward me. I did not flinch. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored white blazer and withdrew the crisp physical hard copies of the contracts and the routing documents. As Charles approached, I held them out to him. He snatched the papers from my hand with a violent, aggressive motion. The entire ballroom held its breath as Charles flipped through the pages. The only sound was the harsh, angry rustling of paper as his eyes scanned the forged signatures, the liability clauses, and the direct linkage to his meticulously guarded family trust. I watched his eyes track over Jasmine's terrible forgery, and then land on Connor's authorized countersignature. The patriarch of the Sterling family slowly lowered the papers. He turned his head, the movement stiff and mechanical like a turret locking onto a target. He fixed his son with a lethal, unblinking glare that promised absolute destruction. Connor's knees visibly buckled. He raised his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture, shaking his head frantically. "Dad, please." Connor whimpered, his voice cracking. "Dad, I can explain. It was a mistake." Charles did not yell. He did not lose control. He spoke with a booming, thunderous resonance that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "Is this true, Connor?" Charles demanded, his voice a terrifying force of nature. "Did you steal from this woman to throw a party?" The air in the grand ballroom seemed to completely solidify. 50 of the most influential people in Atlanta held their collective breath, waiting for the golden boy to speak. Connor stared at his father, his chest heaving heavily under his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. For a fleeting second, I thought he might actually stand tall and take responsibility for the catastrophic mess he had orchestrated. I thought he might attempt to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left in front of his elite peers. But Connor was not a leader. He was a parasite who had spent his entire adult life feeding off the strength and wealth of others. When faced with the terrifying reality of his father's unyielding wrath, the illusion of the dominant alpha male evaporated instantly. He physically shrank. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the edge of the head table and sending a silver water pitcher crashing to the marble floor. "It was her!" Connor shouted, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. He threw his hand out, pointing a trembling finger directly at the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours. Jasmine forged the papers. I did not sign anything. She set the whole thing up. She told me her sister owed her the money. The collective gasp from the audience was loud and undeniable. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in shock, and corporate executives shook their heads in absolute disgust. Throwing his bride to the wolves to save his own skin was a level of spineless cowardice that even this room of cutthroat capitalists found entirely repulsive. Jasmine froze. The sheer shock of the betrayal seemed to momentarily short-circuit her brain. She looked at Connor, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she could not comprehend the words that had just come out of his mouth. For months, they had conspired together, laughing at me, drinking vintage champagne at their exclusive country clubs, and calling me a disposable asset. They had built their entire luxury fantasy on the foundation of my stolen labor. And the very second that foundation cracked, Connor had shoved her into the abyss without a single hesitation. The shock shattered, transforming instantly into a feral, unhinged rage. "You liar!" Jasmine screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat like a siren. The carefully curated mask of the elegant high society bride was completely obliterated. She lunged forward, closing the distance between them, and slammed her hands violently into his chest. "You absolute coward. You knew about every single detail. You sat right next to me on the couch while I filled out the forms. You gave me the routing numbers for your trust fund." She swung her arm, slapping his shoulder and grabbing the satin lapels of his tuxedo. Her heavy diamond engagement ring caught the amber light of the chandeliers as she shook him. "You told me it would work. You said your father would just pay the venue bill like he pays for everything else in your pathetic life. Do not you dare put this all on me." Connor grabbed her wrist, trying to shove her away. his face blotchy red with panic and supreme humiliation. "Shut up, Jasmine. You are making it worse. You are ruining everything. I am ruining it." Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing terribly through the silent ballroom. "You are the one who could not afford to pay for your own wedding. You are completely broke without your daddy." Down on the main floor, the paralysis finally broke. Vivian and Derek scrambled out of their seats at the VIP booth, their chairs screeching harshly against the marble. They rushed the elevated platform, moving with the frantic, uncoordinated panic of people watching their entire social standing burn to ash. Vivian reached the stage first, grabbing Jasmine's arm and attempting to physically drag her away from Connor. "Jasmine, stop it," Vivian hissed frantically, her eyes darting around the room at the staring guests. "People are watching. You are embarrassing the family. Stop screaming this instant." Jasmine ripped her arm out of our mother's grip, her breathing ragged and heavy. "She humiliated me," Jasmine sobbed, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "Zora set this up to ruin my aesthetic. She is doing this because she is jealous." Derek stepped directly in front of Charles, holding his hands up in a placating, deeply submissive gesture. He plastered on the fake, slick smile he used to negotiate bad business deals, trying to project an air of calm authority that he absolutely did not possess. "Charles, please," Derek said, his voice dripping with desperation. "Let us all just take a breath. This is being blown entirely out of proportion. It is just a family misunderstanding. Emotions are running high before the wedding. You know how brides get. Please let us handle this privately in the back room. We can sort out the venue costs right now, just the men." Charles did not move. He did not blink. He looked at Derek the way a person looks at a cockroach they are about to step on. "A family misunderstanding." Charles repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute silence. "Forging a corporate guarantor contract to steal $150,000 is not a misunderstanding, Derek. It is a felony. And trying to tether that fraudulent debt to my family trust is an act of absolute suicidal stupidity. Do not speak to me again." Derek swallowed hard, the color draining completely from his face. He stepped backward, retreating like a beaten dog, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the chaos, letting them tear each other apart on the stage I had built. I watched Vivian frantically trying to silence a hysterical Jasmine. I watched Derek cowering before Charles. I watched Connor hyperventilating as his entire future collapsed around him. For my entire life, they had demanded that I fix their problems, absorb their debts, and tolerate their emotional abuse. Standing there in the cool air of the ballroom, watching their self-destruction, felt like drawing my very first full breath of clean oxygen. I tapped the screen of my tablet one more time, clearing the massive projectors and returning the room to its standard ambient lighting. The sudden shift in the visual environment drew Charles' attention away from Derek and back to me. "Connor is lying." "Of course," I said, speaking calmly into the microphone, ensuring my voice cut cleanly through Jasmine's ongoing sobbing. He knew exactly what was happening from the very beginning. When the initial contract was filed, my corporate cybersecurity team flagged the digital signature for immediate review. We do not just look at the ink on the page at Apex Pinnacle, we pull the metadata. I locked eyes with Charles, who was listening with absolute razor-sharp focus. He recognized competence when he saw it. I handed the complete digital forensic report over to the Atlanta Police Department this morning. I explained, my tone analytical and unyielding. The IP addresses logging the forged DocuSign did not originate from a random public location or a coffee shop. The data proves the signature was executed directly from the secure wireless network inside Connor and Jasmine's shared luxury apartment. They are both entirely complicit. The authorities already have the time-stamped evidence proving they actively conspired to commit corporate wire fraud. Connor let out a strangled gasp, his legs finally giving out. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the head table to keep from collapsing completely onto the floor. Vivian let out a loud, horrified wail, burying her face in her hands. The word police had completely shattered whatever delusional hope they had left of containing the situation. The realization that they could not bully or manipulate their way out of digital forensic evidence was utterly paralyzing. Charles processed the information with the chilling efficiency of a supercomputer. He looked at the hard copies of the contracts still gripped tightly in his hand. He looked at his son, who was currently weeping openly at the head table, entirely stripped of his country club arrogance. Then Charles reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek black smartphone. He did not yell. He did not throw a tantrum. He simply unlocked the screen and pressed a single speed dial contact, putting the phone to his ear. The ballroom was so dead silent that everyone on the elevated platform could hear the line ringing. Richard Charles commanded, his voice echoing with lethal finality the moment the call connected. "This is Charles. Initiate the zero-tolerance protocol on Connor's accounts immediately. Freeze his primary checking, freeze the secondary credit lines, and revoke his access to the family trust portfolio. Cut him off completely. He does not have authorization to move a single cent." Connor let out a sound that was half scream and half sob, pushing himself off the table and lunging toward his father. "Dad, no. Dad, please, you cannot do this. I have nothing. I cannot pay for any of this without the trust." Charles lowered the phone, his expression completely devoid of any paternal warmth or sympathy. "You should have thought about that before you attach my name to your criminal incompetence," he stated coldly, looking down at his son. "You are completely on your own." Connor fell to his knees. The sound of his kneecaps hitting the imported marble floor echoed with a sickening thud. He reached out, grabbing the impeccably tailored fabric of his father's trousers. He was weeping openly now, the tears streaming down his flushed face and dripping onto his starched white shirt collar. He begged for mercy, for a second chance, for a private conversation. But Charles Sterling looked down at his son with an expression of absolute glacial disgust. Charles stepped back, breaking Connor's grip with a sharp jerk of his leg. He looked at the sniveling man on the floor and delivered the final fatal blow to Connor's entire existence. "You are not just cut off from the trust," Charles said, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. "Your employment at Sterling Holdings is terminated effective immediately. You will clear out your desk by tomorrow morning under the supervision of my security detail. I want the corporate credit cards. I want the keys to the company car. I want the access fobs to the executive suites and the penthouse. You have spent your entire life believing your last name shielded you from consequence. Tonight you learn that my name is a privilege you no longer deserve." Connor let out a guttural wail. It was the sound of a parasite being violently ripped away from its host. He had never worked a day in his life without the safety net of his father's empire. He had no real skills, no genuine work ethic, and no identity outside of his immense wealth. In the span of 60 seconds, Charles had reduced him to absolutely nothing. Charles turned his back on his weeping son, entirely erasing Connor's presence from his reality. He swept his cold, calculating gaze across the room, finding his wife Beatrice sitting frozen at her table. Beatrice was a woman who had spent decades cultivating a flawless reputation among the high society elite. She understood the assignment immediately. "We are leaving," Charles announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "This wedding is cancelled." What happened next was a masterclass in the brutal efficiency of old money. There was no shouting, no dramatic arguments, and no hesitation. The Sterling family and their elite social circle moved with a synchronized, terrifying unity. 50 chairs scraped against the marble floor simultaneously. Men in custom tuxedos and women in designer gowns stood up as one cohesive unit. They did not look at my parents. They did not look at Jasmine. They did not look at the elaborate floral centerpieces or the expensive catering that had been ordered to impress them. They simply gathered their belongings and turned toward the exit. The sound of their departure was deafening in its quietness. The rustling of heavy silk, the clicking of expensive heels, the low murmurs of extreme disapproval all blended into a symphony of social execution. Vivian finally broke out of her paralysis. The reality that her ultimate social climbing victory was walking out the door sent her into a blind panic. She lunged forward, abandoning Jasmine on the stage, and ran toward Beatrice. "Beatrice, please," Vivian begged, her voice shrill and desperate as she reached out to grab the older woman's arm. "Please do not do this. We can fix this. The children just made a terrible mistake. We can pay for the venue ourselves. We can smooth this over. Think of the guests. Think of the invitations. We cannot just cancel everything. Beatrice Sterling stopped. She did not physically pull away from Vivian, but she turned her head and delivered a look of such absolute aristocratic disdain that Vivian instantly dropped her hand as if she had been burned. "You are delusional," Beatrice stated, her voice dripping with lethal aristocratic frost. "Your daughter is a criminal who attempted to steal from my family. Your entire family is a liability. You will never contact us again. You will not call. You will not write. If you or your daughter attempt to approach my son, I will personally ensure your husband's business is audited into oblivion. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Vivian shrank backward, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, humiliated sob. Derek stood paralyzed by the VIP booth, watching his financial and social aspirations disintegrate into dust. He had spent his entire life bullying his own children to project an image of power, but faced with true, unyielding authority, he was nothing more than a coward. I caught Marcus's eye across the room and gave a single sharp nod. Marcus signaled his team, and the heavy mahogany doors were smoothly unbolted and pulled open. The Sterling family marched out of the ballroom, exiting my property with the cold precision of an army retreating from a contaminated battlefield. Charles walked out last, not looking back even once at the son he had left sobbing on the floor. On the elevated stage, the aftermath of the explosion was playing out in spectacular fashion. Jasmine was hyperventilating, her carefully pinned hair unraveling and falling around her face in messy strands. The realization that she was no longer marrying into a billion-dollar empire hit her with staggering force. She dropped to her knees, her heavy beaded gown pooling around her on the platform. "Connor," she cried out, her voice desperate and pleading. "Connor, please. We can figure this out. We can elope. We love each other. We do not need his money. We have each other." She reached out and grabbed Connor's tuxedo jacket, desperately trying to pull him toward her. But Connor did not look at her with love or partnership. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. Jasmine was no longer a beautiful trophy wife. She was the anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. She was the reason he had just lost his entire fortune, his career, and his father. "Get your hands off me!" Connor roared, his face contorted with violent rage. He violently shoved Jasmine's shoulders, pushing her backward. Jasmine let out a sharp cry as she fell hard against the stage, her expensive dress tangling around her legs. "You ruined my life!" Connor screamed, pointing a shaking finger at her as she lay crying on the floor. "I have nothing because of you. I am completely broke because of you. I never want to see your face again." Connor did not spare her another second. He scrambled to his feet, completely ignoring his sobbing fiancée, and bolted off the stage. He ran toward the open doors, his polished dress shoes slipping wildly on the marble floor. "Dad," he screamed, his voice echoing down the corridor as he chased after the man who had just destroyed him. "Dad, please wait, Dad, I am sorry, please do not leave me. Please do." His pathetic cries faded into the distance, leaving behind a ballroom that looked like a glamorous war zone. The grand rehearsal dinner was completely obliterated. Half the tables were empty, the remaining guests standing around in awkward, stunned silence. Broken crystal and spilled water covered the floor near the head table, and in the center of it all was my family. Jasmine lay crumpled on the elevated platform, weeping hysterically into her hands. Vivian rushed onto the stage, falling to her knees beside her favorite daughter, wrapping her arms around Jasmine's shaking shoulders and crying right alongside her. Derek finally moved, shuffling onto the stage with his head bowed, looking completely broken and defeated. They were a portrait of absolute devastation. They had sacrificed my mental health, my financial security, and my relationship with my daughter just to secure this perfect moment. And I had systematically dismantled it in under 20 minutes. I stood a few feet away from them, perfectly calm, perfectly poised. The optic white fabric of my tailored suit remained completely unwrinkled. I had not yelled. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had simply presented the truth and allowed their own toxic entitlement to tear them apart. I felt a profound, undeniable sense of closure. The terrified, desperate girl who used to beg for their approval was completely gone. In her place stood a woman who controlled her own destiny. I smoothed my lapels, preparing to instruct my security team to clear the rest of the room. I was ready to go upstairs, collect my beautiful daughter Chloe, and take her home. The show was officially over, but as I turned toward Marcus, the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly shifted. The tall, sweeping glass windows that overlooked the venue's grand circular driveway lit up with a chaotic, strobing glow. Bright, flashing beams of violent red and piercing blue began sweeping across the dark walls of the ballroom, reflecting off the imported crystal chandeliers and casting eerie dancing shadows across the faces of the remaining guests. The low, rhythmic wail of approaching sirens echoed through the thick glass, cutting through the sound of Jasmine's relentless sobbing. The sirens grew louder and louder, indicating multiple vehicles rapidly converging on the property. I looked at Marcus, who tapped the earpiece hidden in his collar. He listened for a brief second before looking directly at me, his expression entirely serious. He gave me a sharp, confirming nod. The police had arrived, and they were not here to issue a warning. The heavy mahogany doors pushed open with a forceful, synchronized motion. Two plainclothes detectives stepped through the entryway, their silver badges gleaming under the dim ambient light of the ballroom. Behind them, two uniformed officers flanked the doors, sealing off the room completely. The chaotic, pulsing red and blue lights from their cruisers, parked in the circular driveway, bled through the massive sheer curtains, painting my parents' horrified faces in alternating shades of crimson and cobalt. I had made the call exactly 1 hour before the rehearsal dinner began. I had personally arranged for the complete digital forensic report to be delivered directly to the Financial Crimes Division earlier that afternoon. The timing was entirely intentional. I wanted Jasmine to feel the absolute dizzying peak of her unearned triumph before I dismantled her world piece by piece. "Jasmine Wilson," the lead detective said. His voice cut through the sounds of my sister's frantic, hysterical sobbing. He did not ask a question. He stated a cold, undeniable fact. Jasmine scrambled backward, her expensive designer stilettos slipping wildly on the polished marble floor. She looked exactly like a cornered animal, her chest heaving as she held her trembling hands up in front of her face. "No," she gasped, her voice shrill with terror. "You cannot be here. This is a private party. You are ruining my wedding." Vivian immediately stepped in front of her golden child, attempting to leverage her country club authority on men who clearly did not care about her social standing. "Officers, there has been a terrible mistake," Vivian insisted, her voice vibrating with manufactured, desperate outrage. "This is simply a private family dispute over a venue bill. My husband will write a check right now and clear this entire thing up. You need to leave my daughter alone." The detective completely ignored my mother. He walked straight past her, his eyes locked dead onto Jasmine. I stepped forward, descending the steps of the elevated platform, and handed him the thick manila folder I had kept securely inside my blazer. "Here is everything you need, detective," I said, my voice projecting clearly in the silent room. The original forged corporate guarantor contracts, the verified routing numbers attempting to access the Sterling family trust, and the digital forensic reports tracing the IP address directly to her personal devices. The secure venue access logs are also included. The detective took the heavy file, glancing at the top page before looking back at my sister. "Jasmine Wilson, you are under arrest for felony forgery, corporate wire fraud, and attempted identity theft. Put your hands behind your back." The sound that tore out of Jasmine's throat was not human. It was a guttural, feral screech of absolute terror. She physically fought the officers, thrashing her arms wildly and kicking out, but she was no match for them. They grabbed her wrists with practiced efficiency, pulling them firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs engaging echoed through the empty ballroom like a final, devastating judgment. "You have the right to remain silent," the second detective recited, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he read her the Miranda rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They turned her around and began marching her toward the exit. Jasmine stumbled forward, her legs entirely giving out beneath her. The heavy, intricate train of her custom-beaded gown caught under the heavy tactical boots of the officers. The delicate imported silk and lace ripped loudly, tearing away from the bodice and dragging pathetically across the floor. She looked completely broken, a manufactured fraud being dragged out of a palace she had desperately tried to steal. "Mom! Dad, do something!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing down the long corridor as the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind her, cutting off her cries. Then there was only a suffocating silence. Vivian and Derek were left standing alone in the center of the massive empty ballroom. The opulent floral arrangements and the untouched gourmet catering mocked their absolute ruin. Derek stood completely paralyzed by the head table. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the marble floor as his mind ruthlessly calculated the catastrophic financial damage. He was a man who lived and died by financial spreadsheets, and the math he was doing in his head was tearing his reality apart in real time. "The bail," Derek muttered out loud, his voice hollow and trembling violently. "A high-profile criminal defense attorney will require a $50,000 retainer just to look at a federal corporate fraud case. We will have to liquidate the retirement accounts. The early withdrawal market penalties alone will destroy us." He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, his breathing shallow and rapid, his hands shaking at his sides. "And the venue debt. The contract is still legally binding on her end. Apex Pinnacle will come after us for the $150,000. We will have to leverage the house. We have to mortgage our home just to keep her out of federal prison." Derek realized in that singular, devastating moment that his golden child had not just destroyed her own life. She had financially annihilated him. The comfortable, wealthy retirement he had planned, the social status he had ruthlessly protected, all of it was entirely gone. He was going to spend the rest of his life working to pay off a party that ended in handcuffs. Vivian could not process the financial ruin. Her mind was entirely consumed by the social execution she had just endured. She slowly turned away from the empty doorway and looked at me. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes bloodshot and wide with sheer, unadulterated desperation. She saw me standing there, completely untouched by the wreckage, radiating calm authority. Vivian dropped to her knees. She crawled across the marble floor, her expensive gown soaking up the spilled water from Connor's broken glass. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the optic white fabric. "Zora, please!" Vivian sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged wheeze. "Please, I am begging you. Drop the charges. Call the police and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you gave her permission. We will do anything you want. We will give you anything. She is your sister." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years making sure I knew I was unwanted, unworthy, and unloved. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity in my chest. There was no hesitation. There was only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a surgeon completing a successful amputation. "You threw away my daughter's cake because she was not worth the fridge space," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You looked me in the eye and told me my child did not matter. Today I threw away your legacy because you were not worth my mercy." Vivian let out a strangled gasp, her hands falling away from my suit as if she had been burned. The brutal, undeniable truth of my words struck her with physical force. She knew in that exact second that she had actively created the monster that just devoured her favorite child. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked off the elevated platform. I crossed the ballroom, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, keeping a steady, powerful rhythm. I walked over to the VIP booth where Chloe was sitting quietly holding her favorite coloring book, shielded from the worst of the chaos by my security team. I reached out and gently took her small, warm hand in mine. "Come on, sweetie," I murmured, offering her a soft, genuine smile. "It is time to go home." As I approached the main exit, Malik stepped forward from the shadows. He looked at the wreckage of the room, and then he looked at me, his posture radiating absolute professional respect. "Lock up the venue, Malik," I instructed smoothly, not breaking my stride. "Ensure the cleaning crew bills the Sterling Trust for the broken glass and the spilled water before their accounts are fully frozen by their bank." Right away, Ms. Wilson, Malik replied, stepping aside to hold the heavy door open for us. I walked out into the cool, crisp night air. Behind me, the muffled sounds of Vivian and Derek sobbing loudly in the ruins of their golden child's life faded into nothingness. The drive home was incredibly peaceful. The bright city lights of Atlanta blurred past the tinted windows, casting a warm, golden glow inside the quiet cabin of the car. Chloe had fallen fast asleep in the back seat, her steady, soft breathing filling the silence. I kept both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling a profound, unshakable serenity settle deep into my bones. I had anticipated feeling a twinge of guilt, perhaps a fleeting moment of regret for destroying my own family. But there was absolutely nothing. No guilt, no regrets. I felt only the quiet, immense satisfaction of a malignant tumor finally being excised from my life. The poison was gone. I was finally free. The next morning, the sun rose bright and warm, spilling brilliant light across the hardwood floors of my kitchen. I was standing at the marble island pouring a fresh cup of coffee, listening to the soft, cheerful sounds of cartoons playing in the living room. My phone buzzed against the countertop. The screen lit up, displaying a new text message notification. It was from my father. The message was a long, rambling block of desperate text. He was begging for a loan. He was pleading for an advance on the venue debt, promising to pay me back with interest, begging me to remember that we were blood and that family helps family. He sounded broken, terrified, and entirely pathetic. I picked up the phone. I did not read past the first 2 lines. I calmly opened his contact profile, scrolled to the very bottom of the screen, and pressed a single button. Block caller. I set the phone face down on the counter, picked up my warm coffee mug, and walked into the living room to watch cartoons with my daughter. The morning sun broke across the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm golden hue over the sprawling grounds of the Grand Sterling estate. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and morning dew, completely washing away the toxic residue of the previous night. I drove my car up the winding private driveway, the tires crunching softly against the pristine white gravel. When we reached the main entrance, the heavy wrought iron gates were firmly shut. A tasteful custom-engraved sign hung perfectly centered on the dark metal closed for a private event. I parked near the front portico and stepped out, breathing in the absolute, uninterrupted peace of my own property. There were no news vans, no frantic socialites, and certainly no scheming relatives lurking in the shadows. The frantic flashing of red and blue police sirens had been entirely replaced by the gentle morning light filtering through the ancient oak trees lining the perimeter. The estate was completely locked down. I had given the entire public-facing staff the day off, with full pay, to ensure that this day belonged strictly to us. I opened the passenger door and helped Chloe out of her car seat. She was wearing a vibrant green princess dress, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated excitement. She had no idea about the corporate wire fraud, the dramatic arrests, or the brutal disinheritance that had transpired beneath this very roof just 12 hours prior. To her, yesterday was simply a day her grandmother had been mean about a cake, and today was the day her mother promised to make it right. We walked hand in hand up the sweeping marble steps to the main entrance. Malik stood by the heavy mahogany doors, no longer wearing his strict, tactical security uniform. Instead, he wore a relaxed linen shirt and slacks, offering a wide, genuine smile as we approached. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson," Malik said, his voice warm and bright. He looked down at Chloe and offered a sweeping theatrical bow. "And a very happy birthday to Princess Chloe. Your castle awaits." Chloe giggled, her joyful laughter echoing lightly against the stone portico. We stepped inside the grand foyer, and the sheer magnitude of the silence struck me. This building was accustomed to the constant hum of high-net-worth networking, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the frantic energy of elite hospitality. But today, the vaulted ceilings and imported marble floors held only the sound of our footsteps. It was a cathedral of my own making, completely purged of the poison that had tried to infect it. I led Chloe down the wide, sunlit corridor toward the main ballroom. The heavy double doors were closed, but the moment we approached, Marcus pushed them open from the inside. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. In less than 12 hours, my dedicated event team had stripped away every single trace of Jasmine's pretentious stolen aesthetic. The sterile optic white linens, the rigid crystal centerpieces, and the suffocating atmosphere of old money arrogance were entirely gone. In their place was a vibrant, breathtaking wonderland, designed exclusively for a 7-year-old girl. The ballroom had been transformed into a lush, magical bayou. Thousands of tiny, warm fairy lights were strung across the vaulted ceilings, mimicking a canopy of fireflies. Rich emerald green and deep purple fabrics draped elegantly across the tables. Massive arrangements of fresh magnolias, water lilies, and Spanish moss filled the room with a sweet, earthy fragrance. It was vibrant, alive, and overflowing with genuine warmth. But the true magic was not in the decorations. It was in the people. Spread across the room were the men and women who had built Apex Pinnacle alongside me. Marcus Malik, my executive assistant Sarah, and the entire senior event coordination team were standing around the main floor. They were not on the clock. They were not wearing their corporate earpieces or carrying clipboards. They had come on their rare day off, bringing their own children and partners simply to celebrate the daughter of the woman they respected. They erupted into cheers and applause the second Chloe stepped through the doors. My daughter's eyes went wide with absolute awe, her hands flying to her cheeks as she took in the magical room created entirely for her. "Go ahead, sweetie," I whispered, gently nudging her forward. "It is all for you." Chloe ran onto the dance floor, instantly surrounded by the children of my staff, laughing and twirling in her green dress. I stood near the entrance, watching her interact with a community of people who were kind, supportive, and fiercely loyal. There were no forced, rigid smiles here. There was no calculating gossip whispered behind linen napkins. There was only genuine, unfiltered joy. "Ms. Wilson," a deep voice said from my right. I turned to see Julian, my executive pastry chef, stepping out from the kitchen corridor. He was wearing his pristine white chef's coat, a look of immense pride plastered across his face. Julian was a culinary artist who had turned down offers from Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris and New York to head the kitchen at the Grand Sterling. He knew the story of the smashed grocery store cake. I had told him exactly what Vivian had done, how she had thrown my daughter's simple birthday treat into the garbage, because it was not worthy of the refrigerator space. "Is it ready, Julian?" I asked, a slow smile spreading across my face. "It is the finest piece of work my kitchen has ever produced," Julian replied, gesturing toward the center of the ballroom. I followed his gaze as two of his sous chefs carefully rolled a draped cart onto the center of the marble dance floor. The chatter in the room naturally died down as everyone gathered around in a large, expectant circle. I walked over and stood right behind Chloe, placing my hands gently on her small shoulders. Julian grabbed the edge of the velvet drape and pulled it away with a dramatic flourish. A collective gasp of sheer wonder echoed through the massive hall. Sitting in the center of the room was the most magnificent, towering, custom-made Princess Tiana birthday cake I had ever seen. It was an absolute masterpiece of sugar and engineering. It stood a staggering 5 tiers high, draped in flawless, shimmering emerald fondant. Delicate handcrafted sugar water lilies cascaded down the sides, their petals dusted with edible gold. Intricate spun sugar vines wrapped around the base and perched at the very top was a perfect, glittering replica of Tiana's crown. It was a cake built for royalty. It was 10 times taller, 10 times more expensive, and 1,000 times more beautiful than the cheap, pathetic little sheet cake my mother had casually tossed into the trash. I stared at the towering confection, feeling a profound surge of vindication. Vivian had tried to teach my daughter a lesson in insignificance. She had tried to demonstrate that Chloe was small, unwanted, and entirely expendable in the grand hierarchy of our family. But looking at this masterpiece, I knew I had permanently rewritten that narrative. I had not just provided a replacement cake. I had provided an undeniable, monumental monument to my daughter's worth. I was showing Chloe that she did not have to beg for scraps from people who despised her. I was showing her that she owned the entire bakery. Chloe stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pure joy. She looked up at the towering tiers of green and gold, completely mesmerized. Is that really for me, Mommy? She whispered, her voice full of wonder. Every last bite, my love. I replied, my heart swelling with an overwhelming protective love. The staff began to sing. The rich, uncoordinated but incredibly warm chorus of Happy Birthday bounced off the marble walls and vaulted ceilings. Last night, those same acoustics had amplified the sounds of a family destroying itself through greed, felony fraud, and toxic entitlement. The walls had echoed with Jasmine's panicked screaming, Connor's cowardly betrayal, and Charles Sterling's thunderous disinheritance. Today, the room was entirely scrubbed of that darkness. The acoustics now carried only the sounds of celebration, of loyalty, of a community coming together to lift up a child. Julian stepped forward and lit the 7 tall golden candles arranged around the base of the sugar crown. The small flames flickered, casting a warm light against Chloe's face. "Make a wish, Princess," Julian said kindly, stepping back into the circle of my staff. Chloe closed her eyes tight, her face scrunched in deep, adorable concentration. She took a massive breath, puffing out her cheeks, and blew with all her might. The 7 golden flames extinguished instantly, sending tiny wisps of gray smoke curling up toward the crystal chandeliers. The ballroom erupted into loud cheers. Malik blew a party horn, and Sarah began passing out the custom-designed plates Julian had prepared. Chloe spun around, throwing her arms around my waist and hugging me with astonishing force. She was completely happy. She was entirely safe. Her innocent laughter rang out, filling the massive hall, a sound so pure and unbroken that it brought a fierce, triumphant smile to my face. I stepped back, allowing the staff to serve the children, and walked slowly toward the edge of the room. I leaned against a grand marble pillar, folding my arms across my chest, and took a long, sweeping look at the life I had built with my own 2 hands. I thought about my parents currently sitting in the ashes of their ruined reputation. Derek was likely liquidating his retirement accounts to pay for Jasmine's criminal defense, and Vivian was likely staring at the walls of a heavily mortgaged house, realizing she had permanently alienated the only daughter capable of saving them. They had spent their entire lives worshipping the illusion of status, and in the end it had left them completely destitute and utterly alone. I looked back at the center of the ballroom. I watched Marcus laughing as he handed a slice of cake to his young son. I watched Julian carefully cutting the delicate sugar flowers to ensure every child got a piece of the magic. I watched Chloe radiating confidence and joy, surrounded by people who protected her simply because it was the right thing to do. I had reclaimed my respect. I had secured my peace. I had solidified my empire. The generational curse of my biological family had been permanently severed, cut away like dead weight, and left to rot outside the gates of my property. I had learned the ultimate, undeniable truth of survival. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. And looking at the joy echoing through my grand ballroom, I knew my family was doing just fine. The greatest lesson learned from this story is that blood does not automatically make someone family. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine love, not manipulation or conditional approval. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your greatest source of pain, the most powerful revenge is simply choosing yourself. By walking away from toxic environments and building your own independent success, you reclaim your power and value. You are not a disappointment. You are a survivor. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives? Share below and subscribe.